Today on the Forgiven Nutritionist podcast, I'm talking with Lilly Risch. She fell in love with EMDR therapy after experiencing the benefits through her own personal therapy journey. EMDR helped her let go of the past and feel better internally. This is what made her want to help her clients in a deeper and more sustained way. Some of Lilly's experience includes residential treatment centers, 7 years of medical social work experience at Children's Hospitals Colorado, and lead intake caseworker for sexual assault investigations and co-therapist for groups supporting child survivors of sexual abuse. She attended Tufts University outside of Boston, Massachusetts. She's also attended the University of Denver's Graduate School of Social Work. Here's a clip from today's show.
I think that anyone could really benefit from EMDR when we're looking at symptoms from the AIP lens. Now, I find that people who have done a lot of other therapies and feel stuck are excellent candidates for EMDR. We can then start working with EMDR. If a client is coming into the door who maybe hasn't done therapy before, we might be backing up and doing more maybe mindfulness skills or CBT skills or general coping skills before we jump into EMDR. So I have a good amount of inquiries that come to me who say, I've done years of talk therapy and I feel like I'm still experiencing the same symptoms. So I think those, people who want to go deeper and get to the root of symptoms are excellent candidates for EMDR.
Hey everyone, just a quick break to show some gratitude to our sponsors and give you some special deals. BrainMD nutraceuticals are high-quality supplements specifically designed to support and enhance brain health. Developed by Dr. Daniel Amen and his team of experts, these supplements use carefully selected ingredients backed by scientific research to promote cognitive function, mood stability, and overall mental wellness. BrainMD's commitment to purity and efficacy assures that their supplements provide targeted nutrition for the optimal brain performance and long-term brain health. Be sure to click my link in the show notes.
Thank you so much for joining me tonight, Lilly.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, I'm a little bit familiar with you because we've done some events. I met you at a networking event and we found you. We referred to you at the Amen clinics. But why don't you tell my listeners a little bit about yourself, maybe how you ended up in therapy or even in EMDR?
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks again for having me. Name is Lilly and have been a therapist. I graduated with my master's in social work and then went on to get my license in clinical social work. And like many social workers, have worked in a variety of settings and then began practicing EMDR in 2018 in a private practice that I had in Denver. I recently moved to Milwaukee 3 years ago and have been in private practice since then here in Milwaukee. I have my own group practice in Metro Milwaukee and Wauwatosa, and I have 2 associate therapists there, and then I have a full caseload as well. I got into EMDR through my own personal therapy journey. I was in Denver working in child welfare, actually, and experiencing a lot of secondary trauma. And I just felt like I wasn't getting past the reactions. I wasn't getting past the anxiety. It was really hard to show up at work. And my therapist at the time practiced EMDR and we did it. And it was really life-changing and powerful for me. And then throughout my time in Denver, I opened a part-time private practice and then decided to get trained then. And then the rest is history.
That's awesome. Well, and as you and I were just talking, one of the reasons I was super excited to have you on and that we met is because now I'm exposed to a plethora of treatment modalities in therapy. And as many people know, in my depression and anxiety struggles years ago, I, of course, was like everybody else and prescribed medication and prescribed talk therapy. And the therapy was very helpful. It was very literally therapeutic.
Absolutely.
To have that third party just to bounce off some ideas or to get them out from swirling in your head. However, I never had a clue that there were so many different types of therapy. And I don't think everybody else has a lot of idea that there's so many different types of therapy that can, and like you said, you felt stuck. And so I think that's, if some people feel stuck, maybe this might kind of open their eyes too at maybe just the talk therapy portion isn't what they need. They need a little bit deeper. So hopefully they'll We'll gain some insights today.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I agree with all of that. Mm-hmm.
So why don't you tell us what EMDR is?
Sure. So EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization reprocessing. And it was developed in the 1980s by Francine Shapiro. The story that goes along with the explanation of EMDR is that she was a psychologist sitting outside and thinking about something very distressing and looking at squirrels go back and forth in the trees. So her eyes were actually moving to the right, then to the left, then to the right, then to the left. And she felt calmer. And so then she started doing studies on folks like vets with PTSD using eye movements, and they got better, right? So there have been extensive studies done with EMDR, specifically around the treatment of PTSD. I use EMDR in my practice, and EMDR therapists will use EMDR for a whole range of symptoms if the client would like us to, and it really does help get the symptoms unstuck. So EMDR is not just an intervention, it's not just a therapy, but it's also brings in a different way of looking at symptoms through what we call the AIP model, which is adaptive information processing. And so that is essentially looking at symptoms from a way of really understanding, why does it make sense that this symptom is there for this person? So I'm happy to use an example because sometimes it's a lot easier to do that. So if we take an example, and when I talk about symptoms, I'm never using a specific client in mind. I'm just using overall themes that I've seen in my work in using EMDR. So if we think about something like somebody having a hard time and having a lot of anxiety when they're doing presentations for work, like having what we might call imposter syndrome, right? Or feeling a lot of anxiety in their chest, maybe stomach is in knots before they're giving a presentation. They know they're smart enough. They know they have, a really great reputation at work, but still those feelings are still in their body, right? So with the EMDR, what we would first do is we would work on understanding why does this make sense? What's the quality of this anxiety? Is it a feeling of I'm not good enough? Is it a feeling of like something bad's going to happen? I'm going to mess up, right? Then we would work on tracing that feeling back to earlier memories. So it might be that a memory would be linked. A memory that would be linked would be something like dad yelling at this person when they were younger, or experiencing a lot of criticism, or feeling like they were going to do things wrong, right? So this can take some time when we are working with EMDR and really how we're conceptualizing symptoms, right? But the way that we're looking at symptoms it makes sense that when you were younger, you were in a state of hypervigilance because you always had to try your hardest so that you didn't get yelled at by your dad, right?
Yeah.
So with that, the context is sometimes very different, right? We're talking about giving a presentation at work can seem very different on the surface versus a father yelling at a child, right? But it's bringing up the same feeling in your body, right? And then therefore it's getting linked to older memories. So in EMDR, we would say that that's in the same memory network, right? Of feeling not good enough or self-doubt. So that's one of the first things to explain with EMDR, because it really does also change how we look at symptoms. We're looking at symptoms on a much deeper level than just saying it's anxiety and let's just treat the anxiety.
Yeah. And I think hopefully that's one of the things that I'm trying to bring awareness to as well, is that when you look at a symptom, like you said, anxiety, that could be due to a whole host of reasons,
Yes.
And sometimes, you're just standing in your kitchen, drinking a cup of coffee or cooking your eggs over the stove. And it's like, all of a sudden you experience that anxiety for what seems to be literally no reason. And
Correct,
so,
yes.
But yet it's your body telling you something is going on and there's a reason. And so I don't think people ever really think about going back to what those reasons are or what those causes are. And I don't think enough people want to think about that either.
It's such a great point, right? I would also be curious about the word want versus are able to, or maybe something different like that, if that's okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Right. Because I think that so much of what I realize I'm doing as a therapist, I work with adults, is helping people learn how to feel. Because there's a difference between saying I'm sad, but then actually feeling the sad.
Right.
Like I have this conversation all the time with people when I say this is what it could look like if you're sad. You can unclench your jaw, you can open your mouth, you can sob, you can cry, you can hold your arms like this around, like giving you a hug. But if we don't, part of what we're doing with the EMDR is we're working on bringing up the old feelings. And that is what you're saying. That's what you're saying is what I think a lot of the times we avoid if we haven't had that ability to emote in a way, like as children and in our life, in a way that it was really attuned to, like in a way that somebody was there with us, helping us feel supported in the feeling.
Yeah. And it's so interesting over my own years of going through therapy. It was just so interesting to think about some things that I had gone through in the past. And so I could kind of address some of them, and not because I was just rehashing them and to continue talking and living in them, but it was sometimes you have to address them a little bit to get past them and work through them. So you can start to function better instead of just overcompensating or finding a crutch to get through these moments and then still living in that same cycle and circle.
Completely. Absolutely.
So how does EMDR kind of differ from other types of therapy?
So one of the biggest differences is that we're working on all levels of the brain and body. I don't think EMDR is as somatic as we could be. I think like somatic psychology would probably say we're not as somatic as we could be. But when we are setting up our quote unquote target memory, so say with the example I gave, we're working on that feeling of self-doubt when dad is critical when you're say 7, 8 years old. And we are thinking about we're thinking, connecting that with an image of dad yelling. And then we're also connecting it with a negative belief, I'm not good enough. So that's the cognitive component, right? Like we have with cognitive behavioral therapy. But we're going even deeper than that. And we're saying when you bring up that memory, what are the emotions that you feel? So it could be like anxiety in the chest. When you bring up that memory, what do you feel in your body? So body's felt sense or body sensation, it feels tight, right? It feels tingly, something like that. Now, if we're not able to connect with that, then we have to do work around, like I was talking about earlier, right? Like connecting with feelings in body, which can be something we can kind of back up with and work on with EMDRs. If somebody grew up in an environment where they weren't allowed to feel their feelings, that can look a lot like then, kind of numbness or dissociation. And then that's a whole other like step before we do the actual, the actual EMDR. And we're throughout the process of throughout the time that we're processing these memories, we're bringing the client back to all of these levels. So we're bringing the client from the negative belief to the positive belief. What would you rather believe about yourself now? I am good enough, for example. We're bringing the client down to emotion, and then we're bringing them again down to somatic. So if we have a client who's really cognitive and just is thinking about the thoughts, we're going to do a lot of work with them throughout the processing and saying things like, notice what you feel in your body and go with that, right? So one of the biggest differences is we're bringing it down to different levels of processing where we know that memory is stored. There are different types of memory. So we have a somatic memory, felt sense of like, I have this yuck in my stomach, or an emotional memory of when somebody yells at me, it makes me feel anxious. So one of the biggest differences with EMDR and talk therapy is we're getting to all of the different levels, and the unconscious is one of the biggest things too, because when we were a kid, we weren't thinking consciously, I'm not good enough. It just became this really unconscious way of being in the world. If the trauma happened, or, that happened over and over and over again. There are other therapies that are pretty similar to EMDR, and one of those is brain spotting. I'm not trained in brain spotting, but I will just kind of name that. And there is, I think, potential for other therapies to get to those levels. If, for example, there's a cognitive behavioral therapist that's also doing like somatic experiencing. But EMDR is one of the really well-known therapies that is getting to all of those levels.
We have something in our unconscious that, again, and I think I kind of touched a little bit on it, especially when we're kids, we find ways to deal with things and cope with things without realizing that we're coping with things or dealing with things in a negative way. Much like when you go down a detour, it can be helpful for a minute or, this little bit, but you can't stay on that detour forever, and eventually there's going to be another detour that keeps taking you farther away from the original road that you needed to be on. So I think that people don't realize that.
Absolutely.
You need to get back on that original road and find those healthy connections.
Absolutely. And one thing that's really, I think as therapists, it's really maybe refreshing is the right word with EMDR is we are looking at symptoms, just like you said, as adaptive. And that's a big shift, I think, because when we're looking at something like substance abuse or anxiety, we can say, that doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. Like, you're good enough. You're the CEO of a company. You shouldn't be getting anxious. Just reframe your thoughts, right? But if we trace it back, we can understand how a child having hypervigilance and trying to do better every single time and looking over their shoulder because dad's going to get mad makes perfect sense, right? It's just stuck, and it can be let go of, right? It doesn't need to be here in the present. It's just like what you said of it is helpful, just not anymore.
Right. Yeah. That's, and then I think, not to pick on the poor dads out there, because there are plenty of moms that do it as well. But I think it's true. I think it was a great example, because I think we all know somebody, if not in our own immediate personal life, maybe, our aunt or our best friend, their parent is like that, or their aunt is like that, or sometimes even your friends can be that way and you don't realize, so I think it's a good relatable example that you've shared.
Yeah. I try to be relatable. I think, and I'm a parent as well, and I think it's so hard because there is this misconception of like, let's just blaming the parents. And I'd like to say there is no perfect parent. There's no perfect childhood. And so much of what we're doing is just working on understanding the truth, right? And I know that parents do so many good things. It's just we don't always talk about them in therapy. So that can be something hard when people start doing this work as well.
Yeah, well, and one of the things that I was just having this conversation with someone at the Amen clinics recently, our parents, because again, I'm a parent now too. So looking back, I have empathy for my parents because I know what it was like for me 20 years ago when my kids were littler. I did the best I could with what I knew back then.
Yes.
And I was just trying to cope and deal with it at that time. And so I can empathize with my mom or dad, and hopefully other people can empathize too. Okay, my mom or dad maybe was going through some things or unresolved trauma, or who knows what they were trying to deal with and compensate for and trying to figure out in their own way. But they were trying to just raise their kids too and still struggle with their own issues and problems.
Absolutely. Then, and I completely agree with that narrative personally. I will always think it's always important to offer people whatever narrative feels right for them, of like maybe your parents did the best that they could, or maybe you feel like they could have done better. It just is all individual and unique depending on the client. I do personally agree with that, because I think of your and I understanding too of what somebody was, what that parent was experiencing, what their parents what were experiencing. We could keep going back, not just what they were experiencing in their little world, but like what was the world like then?
Yeah.
And so, I mean, there's so many layers of things that can impact one person and their behaviors. So,
Yeah. Well, and luckily they didn't have social media back then. Like everybody has social media.
I know.
Yeah, that's a whole
It
other.
is such an interesting conversation, though.
Yes. I don't think that does anybody any. I mean, I follow doctors, for example, on social media, or I follow like dog or cat pages just to watch.
I love it.
But
I love it.
But still, I still have to put a limit on it, because you can
I
still
know.
become obsessed or worried about, or, like what's going on in everybody else's life. And again, it's just that little snippet, and everybody can make it
Completely.
look good.
Completely. And there is this sense, right? If we look at how we as humans are wired, I'm thinking of the tragedy that happened today in Madison, right?
Right.
And the sense of like looking at our phone, and there is a real deep sense of like, we can't always discern if it's really happening to us right now, or if it's like in a country far, far away. So part of what I think social media is doing that's so hard and increases that sense of like not being threat or not being safe, right? Perceived threat is this sense of like all these bad things happening and us having instant exposure to it.
Well, and honestly, I think that's what caused a lot of my anxiety when I used to experience it, is once you start thinking some negative thoughts, then your body then catches up, and it feels like, oh my gosh, maybe I can't see that car about to hit us, or it thinks, it starts acting like a car's gonna, you're gonna need to swerve to get away from that car, but there's no car, whether it's
correct,
an actual car or some other thing, and so when you start acting a certain way, your body starts reacting a certain way too, and that's what my vicious loop kept getting me stuck in.
Absolutely true. Yeah, makes a lot of sense.
So what would be, for lack of a better term, a good candidate for EMDR? Like, who would you recommend that for?
So I believe anyone can do EMDR, right? I think one of the biggest things, just like with any therapy, is a goodness of fit with a therapist. Because we know that the relationship is one of the most healing things in therapy, right? We need connection by nature, as we are mammals, as we need connection to like exactly live when we're born, right? So we need connection, and that connection is incredibly important, as you know. So I think that anyone could really benefit from EMDR when we're looking at symptoms from the AIP lens. Now, I find that people who have done a lot of other therapies and feel stuck are excellent candidates for EMDR. We can then start working with EMDR. If a client is coming into the door who maybe hasn't done therapy before, we might be backing up and doing more maybe mindfulness skills or CBT skills or general coping skills before we jump into EMDR. So I have a good amount of inquiries that come to me who say, I've done years of talk therapy, and I feel like I'm still experiencing the same symptoms. So I think those, people who want to go deeper and get to the root of symptoms are excellent candidates for EMDR.
Well, and now that I work at the Amen clinics during the day, I definitely recommend EMDR. I did take a training class on it. I personally don't feel like I don't ever want to get certified, but people like you who deal with or help people with, because a lot of times people that go for EMDR experience some significant traumas.
Yes.
So anybody who helps people with trauma, like you mentioned today, the shooting in Madison, that's there's a special place for you, I think.
Well, thank you. It's very much in my nature and nurture, right?
Yeah.
To dive deep and I tell my clients I'm very comfortable with intense emotions. It's probably because I feel them myself too. Right. And just am very familiar with all of the intense emotions and all of the intensity, and just, it's a lot easier for me. It's just so natural and easy for me to really understand and conceptualize how somebody who's sitting in front of me came to be how they are right now. And so I would say the same thing about you and the work you do as a nutritionist with the holistic view, and which I think is incredibly important and another piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes, definitely.
So I just want to say that briefly. Yeah.
Thanks. When it comes to brain health, yeah, I definitely think that what you eat and you put in is definitely going to come out in your emotions and your feelings, or your lack of feelings that you have, because I experienced that as well in my day. Yeah. So since we were talking about trauma, could you, and I know I didn't ask you this, but could you maybe talk about the different types of trauma? Because I know that when I was in school, we learned a little bit the differences between like big T trauma and little t trauma. And I think that most people, and I'm victim of this as well, or guilty of this, I should say, I just always thought of trauma as, you know, like today that you mentioned the school shooting. I never experienced that. I live in Wisconsin where it was, but I was never immediately part of that. Or the Twin Towers, that to me is trauma.
Right.
I was in car accidents, so that to me was kind of a trauma, but not to me. I never thought of it as an emotional trauma. So there was never any, you know, nobody in my family was in jail or incarcerated. You know, so I think that's what people think of when they think of trauma. So I don't think they really realize the different spectrums or the wide range of trauma that there really is.
It absolutely is. And I appreciate you bringing this up. And I think it is because that's how we've labeled trauma, I think, as in a culture, right? I think the DSM, even under PTSD, gives examples such as sexual assault, natural disasters, and exposure to things like that. One of the most important things to understand is that trauma is about the experience, not the event. So I've actually worked with people who have been in car accidents and did not experience ongoing emotional symptoms, right? Like no nightmares, no continued anxiety. And so much of that has to do with the aftermath of it. There's so many different kind of qualification, you know, things that can really impact that, right? So much of what is can be experienced as trauma can have to do with being alone in it. Something happening over and over again, like a repeated event, such as the dad yelling that I was explaining. Like if that is happening over and over and over again, then that can have a lasting impact on an individual. But one definition of trauma that I really like and kind of is very aligned with how I see trauma is too much for too long, too little for too long, or too much too soon. And so I'm happy to go into that a little bit more. But if we think about too much for too long, that could be, like I said, exposure to parents arguing at a very high level, or domestic violence. Exposure to that throughout childhood can really impact kids. Too little for too long. Surprisingly, I work with a lot of adults who experience a lack of emotional attunement or lack of connection, lack of things like eye contact. And I'm talking about like throughout a child's life, lack of being touched, lack of being held, lack of being smiled at. These things can be incredibly impactful to somebody because we need connection when we're kids, right? We need things like food, water, sleep, but we also need things like physical connection. We need eye contact. We need smiles. We need physical and emotional attunement. And so the too little for too long, I think, is a place where I spend most of my time as a trauma therapist, which might be surprising to some. And I've seen anecdotally it can be the most harmful and really heartbreaking to me personally when I think about that, the lack of
Yeah.
right? The lack of that the emotional needs for kids. And then the too much for too soon could be and then too little for too long could be something like not having enough food, like food insecurity, right? I think what we think about a lot, or not having, stability or shelter, things like that can then develop, ongoing symptoms that can be, that can have impact. And then too much too soon can be something like, let's say 8th grader having to care for other kids or having that responsibility, right? Parent telling a child, I've had, heard this a lot, where parents will tell children like specific details of the parent's trauma when the child is young, like 7, right? And then that can definitely get stored for the child as like traumatic, right? Details of a sexual assault or something like that. So those are some examples, but I think if I definitely have like a more broader view of trauma that I think fits the work that we do and fits the work with EMDR.
Yeah. Well, and when you touched on the not enough for too long, is that how you called it?
Yes, too little for too long.
Yes, too little for too long.
Yeah.
We learned about each of those in school last year, actually. And it was very eye-opening to me. It was like, I felt like I was literally going through my own therapy session again, or a new therapy session that had never been touched on, in all the years I'd gone to therapy, because I'm like, oh my gosh, yes. And I immediately thought of a plethora of things, not just in my own life, but in other people that I know. And it was like, all of a sudden the bells started going off. Like, I get it now. I see why that's going on,
Yes, completely.
And I don't think that people ever think about that. They just think that they think it's normal because it's common, and that's what they've grown up to see. And so they think it's, again, normal.
Completely. Absolutely. And like I said, I do think that I think we're shifting a little bit as a culture, but I do think that we've been in a definition of trauma, which these things, I don't think you can experience a sexual assault and not be traumatized. Although, depending on so many different factors, right? Maybe could be more traumatized than others. There's so many different factors, but I do think that very typically that's what we think of when we think about trauma. But like I said, one of the most important things is this shift to, it's about the experience of it. And there's so many different factors that go into that to determine if it's experienced as trauma or not.
Yeah. So can you just kind of walk us through like what a typical, not that therapy is typical, let alone EMDR, but just for the people that have no clue or have never experienced EMDR, what does like an EMDR session look like? Just so they kind of know, because it can kind of sound scary, especially when you're talking about trauma, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's where we rely on therapeutic rapport, how much preparation we have to do. And that's a phase in EMDR as well, preparation and stability. But if we're talking about a standard protocol, like a pretty standard traumatic event that we're desensitizing, that we call it, we will, the therapist with the client will decide on a type of what we call BLS, which stands for bilateral stimulation. And that's where we get the eye movements. We might also do, so in order to do the eye movements, the therapist will go ahead and move their hand back and forth, and the client will just watch the hand go back and forth. Some therapists, like I have this fancy light bar, and it kind of looks like a telescope, but it's just like a long bar, and it has a light that goes back and forth. And I control it in terms of the speed of it, and then the client will just follow the light back and forth. If we're doing a virtual session, we will have a computer program where we have a dot that goes back and forth on the screen. So the client will follow that. Some clients like to keep their eyes closed when they're doing processing. So we have options for that as well. A client could do like a butterfly hug like I'm doing right now. For the listeners, I'm just crossing my arms and putting my left hand on my right shoulder and my right hand on my left shoulder. And then we just tap back and forth. The therapist can also, if the client is comfortable, scoot toward the client and then tap on their knees. So this is just a tapping. And then we also have little pulsers that we can give the client too. So you put one on your right hand and one on your left hand. It's just a vibration that goes back and forth. So we decide on that first, right? And that's what provides the back and forth bilateral stimulation that helps us process through traumatic memories quicker. And then we're setting up the target memory. So for example, with the example I gave before, we are deciding together with the client, what do we want to work on today? And say we're working on the memory of dad yelling. So we ask the client to visualize that. What does the worst part of that look like? It could be just dad's face and furrowed brows, right? And then we're linking, when you think about that, what's the negative belief about yourself? Could be something like, I'm bad. That's it, right? We don't go into it. We don't analyze it. We just name the negative belief. And then we ask the client, when you think about that memory, what would you rather believe about yourself now? Maybe I'm good enough, or it's over, or I'm good now. And then we ask the client, what emotion do you feel when you think about that memory? What do you feel in your body when you think about that memory? And then we ask scaling questions. And we ask on a scale of 0 to 10, 10 being the worst and 0 being neutral, how yucky, and we actually do use that word yucky. How yucky does it feel now? And we don't, like I said, we don't analyze it. We just like gut feeling, how yucky is it? It's an 8. Okay, notice that. And then we just start the buzzers or the eye movements. And we say, just let whatever come up, come up. And this is when we are not talking. And that's different than a lot of therapies, right? So the therapist is providing emotional attunement, and that could look like something like just sitting back and saying, that's it, good work, let whatever come up, come up, and then just allowing some silence. Now, if the client has done EMDR before, they'll know to just start talking or look off the light bar if they have something to say. An example of that could be, that wasn't fair, right? Or an example could be just starting to cry, right? We really literally want to let whatever come up, because we believe in the brain and body's ability to naturally process through something in an adaptive way. And one of the hardest things I will say as a therapist is to stay out of my client's way. So we are not analyzing. We are not saying, you know what I think? Like, we're doing that if our client needs support and is stuck. For complex presentations like dissociation, we may really work on like grounding or something different. But if we're doing the standard protocol, we are staying out of the way. Like, we are a support, we are a guide. We'll bring them back to their body if they need, but we actually just want to trust this process of it. And that's one of the hardest things, I think, as a therapist, is to sit with it, like to sit back and not jump in and tell them they should be feeling angry about something, because if they're not feeling something, they're not ready to feel it, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So that's what an EMDR session can look like. A lot more silence than talking. And it's more tiring for clients. If you think about like dry needling, or deep tissue massage versus a relaxing massage, I like to just compare it to that. We might only do 10 minutes of processing. I've done up to like an hour of processing. But it is making sure that the client knows, like, after this session, you might be more tired, and clearing your day, making sure you drink a lot of water, because we're definitely getting at deeper memories, and which is harder on the system and harder on the body, but does provide more change, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Well,
yeah,
and hopefully people really heard you say that you're there to be a support, because and if I ever went through EMDR or just therapy in general, that's what you really want, is you want that support.
Yes.
And you want to feel like it's about you and helping you and whatever you're going through, versus what the person, the therapist, or sometimes your best friend, they interject their thoughts and feelings, and that's not what you need.
Completely. And one of the biggest pieces of EMDR is, right, especially if there's somebody has an experience where they felt alone, right? Like they were scapegoated, or they experienced something in their family and they felt alone in it. what we're doing in EMDR is what the science of memory reconsolidation, which EMDR is under, it's a disconfirming experience. It's something different. Like it is being able to really sit and feel like somebody is attuning to what I experienced. And that in and of itself is completely healing. Right?
Yeah.
Is somebody witnessing what you went through.
Well, and
And
especially
validating it for you. Yeah, sorry.
and especially like we were talking, especially when you go through a trauma, and although I do know that your dad yelling at you or constantly looking over it can be very traumatic. But when you're talking about the big T traumas, like we mentioned too, like the school shootings, that is something that you definitely, it's like the release that a lot of people need. And I think a lot of people want to push it down and cover it up rather than letting it release so you can keep moving forward.
Exactly it. And I think that, is really, as a parent, it's so hard to see your kids have a hard time. I mean, I have such a hard time when my son has a hard time, but in realizing that it's my stuff that I have to work through in order to let him feel what he feels so that I can attune to whatever it is that he's feeling. But it's not parents don't all the time have that capacity or ability to sit with kids. And it's not always parents, right? It's like teachers, it's our culture. Like you said, Wendy, we're just saying like, you're fine. It's okay. Like just shove it away. When that really does a disservice when there are things that we're experiencing that are hard.
Yeah. I do know somebody, I'm thinking of somebody right now that they do have the habit of saying they even say it to their dog where when their dog is experiencing some, heightened emotions for whatever reason. And, you're fine. And I'm like, just let them feel, they're trying to struggle through. It works.
I know. I do it sometimes too. And I'm just like, I can't deal with your little feelings, 6-year-old.
It's just the UPS man.
Right.
Sometimes it's just the UPS man.
Yes. We do things that engage the back and forth, which is like going for a walk. So a lot of people say like, I will go on a walk when I'm having a hard day. And that is incredibly healthy for us for a lot of different reasons, but it's also engaging the bilateral movement of the left, right.
Yeah.
Even just like drumming too provides that. So there are different things that we are naturally doing as humans that is also providing that. Not that I recommend anyone do EMDR on themselves, but it's engaging the sympathetic nervous system and helping us process through things in a quicker way.
Yeah, and like, much like you said, or we're just talking about dogs, that when dogs shake, it literally helps them shake it off.
Yes.
Yeah. And engage their,
Exactly. Yeah.
So how can someone find a good EMDR therapist?
Sure. So Psychology Today, and then some of the other search engines like Mental Health Match, and then just putting EMDR in there for modalities. Most places have that. And then EMDRIA is the EMDR International Association, and there are lists of EMDR therapists on that website as well. I will say it depends on the area in which you are in the country, right? Sometimes EMDR therapists are out of network because there isn't any additional reimbursement for EMDR from insurance companies. And the EMDR training from a therapist standard is quite expensive. And then if we're doing EMDR ongoing, it is best practice, I believe, to have ongoing consultation because it is such a powerful modality, but then the information or maybe stories of EMDR where people go and then they feel worse is maybe we didn't do enough preparation. We didn't have enough anchors like resourcing where we really work on building up the internal positive feelings about ourselves. And that is, it's just hard for me to see, right? Because I think we have really good intentions, but maybe we're not getting the best consultation. The therapist isn't. My point with that is that costs money, right? If we're continuing to invest in the continuing ed and trainings for EMDR, because it is a pretty complicated and complex intervention, a lot of the times those therapists are only private pay or out of network. So I do also like to kind of plant the seed to that when you're seeing an EMDR therapist, the goal is, right, that you're going to get more symptom relief versus managing symptom.
Mm-hmm.
So it is a very different way to look at what's being presented.
Yeah, it is unfortunate that not just with EMDR, but with a lot of therapists, they're not being covered under insurance for a lot of various reasons. And that's one that EMDR is not usually covered for insurance. But I will definitely put a link to the EMDRIA website in the show notes so people can click on that and take a look. And of course, I'll put your information in there as well.
Wonderful. Yeah. And if people are having a hard time finding an EMDR therapist, if they reach out, I'm always happy to give like lists of resources. One thing that I like to just put out there, because it's not always well known, is my practice, Forward Healing Therapy. We work with Wisconsin Victims Compensation. So anyone who has been a victim of a crime, meaning a police report was filed, it doesn't have to mean that the perpetrator was convicted. We know that many times, right? I'm thinking of sexual assault specifically, there isn't a conviction, but there just needs to be a police report. And then we will work to obtain funding through that resource so the client will not have to pay for therapy. And that has been a program that I've loved working with. And we've been able to get free therapy for people who've experienced crimes. That's been a really great fit for our practice and gotten them some really good therapy that they needed.
That's wonderful. I did not know that you were part of that. Are there what kind of advice do you have for somebody if they're still nervous about starting EMDR?
I would recommend to schedule a free consultation with maybe 3 therapists and to write a list of questions and interview the therapist and ask questions like, how do you approach the things that I'm struggling with? Where would we start? I'm really nervous about EMDR. When you actually do get in therapy, I would talk about the nervousness with the therapist. EMDR is not going to work if you're not feeling comfortable. And so much of everything that happens outside of the therapy room comes in the therapy room. So an example is somebody struggling with people-pleasing tendencies. Like, I just want to make people happy, right? And we're starting EMDR and they're starting to feel like, oh my gosh, I'm not doing it right. Like, what if this doesn't work? What if I'm not doing it right? And I ask questions like, would you like to do that? Would you like to notice what you feel in your body? And they're like, yes. And they really don't want to. They're just saying yes to appease me, right? So if you're feeling nervous, it's important to talk to your therapist about that to help understand what is it that's making you nervous. Because if it's making you nervous that we're going to open this big box of trauma and then you're going to be walking out of the office, that's a really normal worry. And that's really important to talk to your therapist about, because we don't want to make things worse. We don't want to just dive in, right? We want to find your edge, right? So it's like, what pound weight can we have you lift at the gym without breaking your arm, right? But we do want to find your edge. We just don't want to kind of like break your arm, so to speak, right? And so there are things that we can do, such as move very slowly, like dip our toe in the water, while then also grounding to the present and we can also do positive things with the EMDR, which I didn't talk about a lot. So we can do things like visualizing safe, calm place and then doing some eye movements, right? We can do things, we like to visualize things like protective figures, right? We can get really creative with EMDR and visualize nurturing figures. So a lot of what we're doing is we're filling in some of the missing ingredients, especially for that attachment trauma. And that's what I do a lot. But we want to make sure that we have enough of that good stuff to anchor to and to fall back on before we just dive right into the yuck, because that's going to be pretty dysregulating. So I would say it's so important to bring up the fears and worries to your therapist so that you can work through them and notice, like, what is it that we have to do now so that we can make sure that you're getting what you need, and we're doing this in a supportive and safe way for you.
Well, and that's a hard thing when you're struggling with any kind of depression or anxiety, or especially trauma, to be honest with people.
Exactly.
And like you said, I know, again, from my experience too, and I'm sure plenty of people out there, they feed you or say what they think you want to hear sometimes, rather than getting it out there so you can address it and get help working through some of those things. And we don't always say what we should or what we're truly thinking.
It's hard to. It's really hard to. And that's a part of making sure you have the right fit with your therapist. Like, you feel like you can work on, it's not going to happen right away, but work on opening up and being honest and saying what you need. That in and of itself can be really like healing through therapy when you're able to do that. So yeah, those are some things to consider, I'd say.
Well, and isn't that a whole therapy session in itself, to figure out what you want? Because you know, I mean, some people don't. I literally just did this one-page miracle that Dr. Amen talks about. I did a little with somebody else. I mean, I've learned about it. I've done it with some clients, but I never did it myself. Well, I shouldn't say I haven't done it in a long time with myself. And it's really getting to the root of what do you want, or what, when you say you want A, B, and C, what does A, B, and C actually look like? You know, and I don't think enough people actually think about that. And once you figure that out, that can kind of pave a huge way for
completely
how to get there. Sometimes there's still some bumps along the way, but at least you know what's in that light at the end of the tunnel, you know, or what it's going to look like.
Completely. And for people who've experienced trauma and maybe didn't have their needs attuned to, what I like to say to start with, even in the therapy room, we can do that. It's like, how would you like to sit in the couch? Like, you don't have to sit cross-legged in the couch. You can sit on the floor. You can sit crisscross applesauce. You take your shoes off. But that in and of itself can feel really overwhelming, because if you grow up in an environment where you don't have choice, right? Or you don't have adults helping identify what you might need. Like, you look cold, let's get you a blanket. That is such an important part of trauma therapy, is being like, there's a blanket if you need it. I have snacks in my office too, because it can be so therapeutic for people who've experienced food insecurity to say, here are some snacks if you'd like them, they're yours. No? But that it can also, like you're saying, be so overwhelming but thinking of like the basics can be a good place to start, of like, what does my body need right now? You know?
Yeah. That's great.
Yeah.
Okay, so where can people find you, follow you? I know that you're licensed in Wisconsin. I think you're licensed in Illinois as well.
I'm licensed in Colorado, Minnesota, and Wisconsin, not Illinois.
Oh, Minnesota. I knew there was a bordering state somewhere.
There's a Midwest state over here.
That's okay. They can still find you and follow you.
Yes, absolutely. And my practice, Forward Healing, we have a EMDR therapist who also does art therapy. So really great way to integrate other modalities if needed. And then also a therapist that works with young children with attachment. So attachment needs or early trauma, young, like 0 to 4 or 0 to 5. And they can find me on Instagram at forward.healing.therapy, or email me at hello@forwardhealingtherapy.com, or visit my website at www.forwardhealingtherapy.com.
Perfect. I'll also put all that in the show notes.
Wonderful.
And before we wrap up, I always ask my guests for their don't miss this moment. It would be something from the conversation or about the topic. So what would your don't miss this moment be? If you'd want the listener to remember like one main thing, what would it be?
I would say find, in terms of healing, in terms of mental health, find what works for you and know that there are a lot of different modalities out there that I don't believe it's a one size fits all. We're so unique as humans that we need to approach ourselves and the people that come into our office as with their uniqueness. So I would say continue to do your research and know what different therapies are so that you can make the best decision for yourself.
That's perfect way to end it. I love it. Well, thank you so much for being on tonight and taking time away from your personal life and your practice.
Absolutely.
And to be on. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me. It was great. Appreciate it.
This episode is sponsored by Pendulum's GLP-1 product, a unique solution designed to support healthy blood sugar levels and metabolic wellness. GLP-1 is a critical hormone for regulating blood sugar, and Pendulum's advanced formula works with your body to naturally support GLP-1 production. If you're looking to maintain balanced energy, manage cravings, or support your metabolism, Pendulum's GLP-1 product could be a game changer. Click the link in the show notes and use my code FORGIVEN for 20% off your first month's subscription. Give your body the support it needs with Pendulum's GLP-1. If you want to continue learning and hearing all things nutrition for your mind, body, and soul, click like, subscribe, or favorite me on whatever podcast platform you use, or you can find me at ForgivenNutritionist.com. This podcast was designed to educate, inspire, and empower you to achieve your health and wellness goals. It is not meant to diagnose or treat any illness or medical condition or take the place of any treatments from your current healthcare providers.